Our scripture readings found in Proverbs 29, verse 20. Do you see someone who is hasty in speech? There is more hope for a fool than for anyone like that. May the Lord add his blessing to that reading.
Good morning. You know, the Bible tells you to pray without ceasing. Today you need to do that for me. 2 days ago I didn't have a voice. Ray said, see, God answers prayers. No, I'm joking. Yeah. Instead, she had to endure me sending her text messages to converse with her because I couldn't speak. So that was an interesting time. So pray that I get through this. I've got a pocket full of cough drops, so I'm well set. So if you see me slip one of those in, it's not that I'm trying to have some candy. I'm trying not to cough a little too much. Have any of you ever picked a hitchhiker? Got some brave people here. What kind of things ran through your mind when you picked up that hitchhiker? Did you look him over and say, yeah, can I trust him? I have never picked up a hitchhiker. I have rolled down my window and given some money for a bus to someone, but I've never actually picked up a hitchhiker before. I'm going to tell you a story about a guy that I'm just going to call John, who picked up a hitchhiker, and so he picked him up, helped him put his bags in the back of the car, and they started driving along. And as this journey kept going, John became more and more apprehensive and unsure if he had really made a good decision in picking this fellow up. He kind of would glance over every once in a while, and he had that long straggly beard, and he kind of reminded him of the pictures of Charles Manson and all kinds of things. And he was getting a little nervous. So John kind of thought about this, and he reached over to his back pocket, just to, he pretended he was scratching his back, and there was something missing. He couldn't find his wallet. John knew what the problem was. He slammed on the brakes, turned over to the passenger in his car and said, "That's it, give me the wallet right now." Hitchhiker handed it over and got out of the car and just took off running. John pulled in home, and his wife was waiting there for him. And so he starts to tell this story to his wife. Man, you won't believe what happened to me. I was driving down the road, right, and his wife stops him right away and says, "Well, I got to tell you this before you forget. Did you know you left your wallet here this morning?" There are some problems that happen when we start to assume the worst about people. And there are some problems that happen when we just kind of jump to a conclusion because the pieces seem to add up to us. Now there's a story in the Bible that we're going to look at a whole lot today. And I've been a religious person pretty well all my life. And in all my life, I've really only heard this story told one time. And it's kind of strange to me because it's a very important story. And it tells us something that we really should pay a lot of attention to. But we kind of just don't bother to look at it very often. The story, the story is actually found in Joshua chapter 22. And before we jump right into there, I'm going to set the scene for you a little bit. So most of us know the story of the Exodus, where the Israelites left Egypt and under the leadership of Moses, they were wandering through the wilderness, and then Moses is not permitted to enter the promised land, and so Joshua takes over as the leader, and around that time they then start the conquest of the promised land. Which, by the way, I said would be a great name for a movie or a video game or something, Conquest of the Promised Land, but that's something altogether different. Well, we get here to Joshua chapter 22. This conquest had been going fairly well with a few hiccups here and there for the Israelites. And we find that the tribes of Reuben, here I can look at my map and see, Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh had land was actually the first to be conquered. And so they had already won those areas. However, the people of those tribes actually stayed with the rest of the Israelites in order to aid in the fight for the rest of the Promised Land. Now, if you look at the map up here, you will see something very interesting about the land for the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh. They are separated from the others. There's the Dead Sea and the Jordan River that separates them. They are more or less cut off from the other tribes. That's going to be important as we continue in this story. So when we get to Joshua chapter 22, we now come to the point where Joshua allows the people of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh to go back to the land that had already been conquered some time ago. So I'm going to jump into 22 verse 1. We're actually going to read this whole chapter as we progress through here, because there's something really important that it's trying to tell us in this story. So starting off it says, Then Joshua called a meeting of all the people from the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh. He said to them, You have done everything Moses, the Lord's servant, told you to do. You have also obeyed all my commands. For a long time you have supported the other Israelites. You have been careful to obey the commands the Lord gave you. Okay. It's really interesting what Joshua has to say to these people, because later on, I'm wondering if the people will remember these words. You see, he's been careful to obey the commands the Lord gave. He also points out that they've been very faithful to Joshua. That's really going to be important as we keep going here. So now we're going to pick up in verse 4. The Lord your God promised to give the Israelites peace, and he has kept his promise. Now comes to the land that Moses gave you on the east side of the Jordan River. But be careful to obey the teachings and the laws Moses, the Lord's servant, gave you, to love the Lord your God and only obey his commands, to continue to follow him and serve him the very best you can. That's some sound advice. Joshua says, you've done your part. Thanks a lot. But you can go home now. There's only one thing I'm going to tell you. Make sure you remember the things that the Lord has commanded you. Make sure that you continue to follow the teachings that were handed down. One of those teachings that is most important is found in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3. There it says, do not have other gods besides me. That's a very important teaching to remember. So let's continue with Joshua 22. We're now going to be at verse 6. Then Joshua said goodbye to them, and they left and went away to their homes. Moses had given the land of Bashan to East Manasseh. Joshua gave the land on the west side of the Jordan River to West Manasseh. And he sent them to their homes, and he blessed them. He said, Go back to your homes and your riches. You have many animals, silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and many beautiful clothes. Also you have taken many things from your enemies that you should divide among yourselves. The people of the tribes of Gad and East Manasseh had everything that had been asked of them to this point. They stayed with the people, even though their land had long ago been claimed, and they could have said, hey, we're out of here, we've got ours. They stayed with the rest of the people so that they could have their lands too. One would hope that that faithfulness would continue and be recognized in the other tribes. But let's continue. Joshua chapter 22, verse 9. Some of the people from the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh left the other Israelites at Shiloh in Canaan and went back to Gilead. It was their own land given to them by Moses as the Lord had commanded. The people of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh went to Galoah near the Jordan River in the land of Canaan. There they built a beautiful altar. When we read that today, that doesn't really offer up too much significance to us. You can read over it. Okay. They built an altar. Big whoop. But that, even though that seems fairly insignificant to us, it meant something important to Israel. I'm going to read to you from the Matthew Henry commentary. At first sight, it seemed a design to set up an altar against the altar in Shiloh. God is a jealous God for His own instructions. We too should be afraid of obeying everything, We should so too be afraid of everything that looks like or leads to idolatry. In the eyes of the other Israelites, it looked as though the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh were setting up an altar to a pagan god. That's what it looked like to them. They looked over and they said, they've built this altar. What are they thinking? Don't they remember what Joshua told them? Follow the Lord's commands. Let's look at verse 11 here. The other Israelites at Shiloh heard about the altar these three tribes built at the border of Canaan and Gilboa, near the Jordan River on Israel's side. All the Israelites became very angry at these three tribes. So they met together and they decided to fight them. Understandably, they were a little upset. It looked as though they were abandoning the God that had just helped them win their land, that had taken them out of Egypt. It looked to them as though they were abandoning everything that they had stood for. Can anybody point out to me what went wrong here? They assumed something. Now, it may have been right. They may have it right. But there's a big problem that happened here. They looked, they heard, but they never asked. You notice right there at the end it says, so they met together and they decided to fight them. If you go to some translations, that says they met together and decided to kill them. They were ready to kill these three tribes off, wipe them off the face of the planet, because they were worshiping a false god. And all this time, nobody ever thought to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should get their side of the story. Nope. They were ready to charge in. You know, there's actually some important biblical principles, and some of them they didn't really have at that time specifically, but I'm sure they knew them. First one's found in Matthew 18:5. If your brother sins against you, go and rebuke him in private. That doesn't mean let's have a meeting and decide what we're going to do. No, that means let's go to that person first and figure out what's going on. Is that what Israel did in this case? Nope. We're going to sit down and we're going to figure out what's wrong and we're going to fix it. Doesn't matter what they think. The big question that's raised in this situation is, why did the other tribes assume the worst of these three tribes? Why didn't they go to those three tribes first to get to the root of what was going on before they made the decision to kill them? Although the act of building an altar seemed to be against the law that Moses had given, the action of the other tribes of Israel was also against that very same law. Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 14. You are to inquire, investigate, and interrogate thoroughly if the report turns out to be true that these detestable things, or this detestable thing has happened among you. Answer me this. Did the Israelites fire? No. Did the Israelites investigate? No. Did the Israelites interrogate thoroughly? Nope. They thought they had it right. They thought the other three tribes were wrong. So they already knew what the conclusion was going to be. Fortunately, though, there were a few sound minds within the camp of Israel. Let's continue. We're going to go to verse 13 here. The Israelites sent Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, to Gilead to talk to the people of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh. Excuse me. They also sent one leader from each of the 10 tribes at Shiloh. Each of them was a leader of his family's group of Israel. The leaders went to Gilead to talk to the people of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh. If you actually delve into several commentaries and read about this particular chapter, you will discover that it took a good amount of persuasion on the part of Phinehas to say, hey, maybe we should go talk to these people before we go and kill them. The conventional thinking in the tribes of Israel was, we need to kill these people now. It was the sound minds that had to argue the point that we need to go and investigate before we pass a judgment. And you know, Phinehas was really a good man for the job. We can read about him in Numbers 25, verse 11. It says, Phinehas, son of Eleazar the prophet, or the son of Aaron the priest, has saved the Israelites from my anger. He hates sin as much as I do. Since he tried to save my honor among them, I will not kill them. Phinehas was a godly man. And it's very fortunate that he was around at this time, because the outcome could have been very bad. So Phinehas takes the elders with him, and he confronts the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh about their perceived lawlessness that's taking place in their camp. Let's take a look at what he said. It's continued on in Joshua 22, verse 16. There they said, all the Israelites ask you, why did you turn against the God of Israel by building an altar for yourselves? You know that this is against God's law. Remember what happened at Peor. We still suffer today because of that sin, for which God made many Israelites very sick. And now you are turning against the Lord and refusing to follow him. If you don't stop what you are doing today, the Lord will be angry with everyone in Israel tomorrow. If your land is unclean, come over to our land where the Lord's tent, with the Lord's tent. Share it with us. But don't turn against God, or turn against the Lord and us by building an altar for the Lord our God. Remember how Achan, son of Zechariah, refused to obey the commands about what must be completely destroyed. That one man broke God's law, but all the Israelites were punished. Achan died because of his sin, but others also died. That was a very heartfelt plea from the part of Phinehas. There's a slight problem with it, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it was a very heartfelt plea. Phinehas said to the people of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh, look back at all these terrible things that have happened in the past every time we turn against God. Are you really going to make that same mistake again? Are you really going to turn against God again and bring this terrible shame upon us? Now let me give you an illustration of how I pictured this particular conversation going. I'll start with Phinehas. Look at all these things that are happening to us. All these things have happened in the past. I mean, didn't you remember? Yes, but I mean, come on. Look what happened to Peor. Look what happened to Achan. Yes, but can I? No, I mean, you have to understand. Phinehas is giving a really heartfelt plea, but he's not listening to anything that has to be said yet. He went there with the right idea. Let's talk to them. Unfortunately, he's got the idea of talking to them or at them. He's not really listening to anything they have to say. I wonder if we too have that same attitude when we want to approach someone. They've got it wrong, and I'm going to talk at them to get them to change their path. Maybe some of you have experienced it. Hey, here's a couple dozen pages I copied out of Spirit of Prophecy for you to read. Hey, here's about 20 Bible verses that I think you need to study, and then we can talk. Maybe we've had that attitude in our life too. Let's look at the next part here, and this part is quite long, but it's interesting. This is the response from the three tribes. It starts in verse 21. The people from Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh answered, "The Lord is God of gods. The Lord is God of gods. God knows, and we want you to know also. If we have done something wrong, you may kill us. If we broke God's law, we ask the Lord himself to punish us. We did not build this altar to offer burnt offerings or grain and fellowship offerings. We did not build it for that reason. We feared someday your people would not accept us as part of your nation. They might say, 'You cannot worship the Lord, the God of Israel.' Between you and us, and your people of Reuben and Gad. You cannot worship the Lord, so we feared that your children might make our children stop worshiping the Lord. That is why we decided to build this altar. But it is not for burnt offerings and sacrifices. This altar is proof to you and us and to all our children who will come after us that we worship the Lord, with our whole burnt offerings, grains, and fellowship offerings. This was so your children would not say to our children, 'You.' In the future, if your children say that, our children can say, 'See the altar made by our ancestors. It is exactly like the Lord's altar, but we do not use it for sacrifices.' It shows that we are part of Israel. Truly, we don't want to be against the Lord or stop following him by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, or sacrifices. We know the only true altar to the Lord our God is in front of the holy tent." End of the stick there. It seems like they made a big mistake in their judgment. Starting with verse 30. When Phinehas the priest and the 10 leaders heard the people of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh, they were pleased. So Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, said, "Now we know that the Lord is with us, and you didn't turn against him. Now the Israelites will not be punished by the Lord." Then Phinehas and the leaders left the people of Reuben and Gad in Gilead and went back to Canaan, where they told the Israelites what had happened. They decided not to fight the people of Reuben, Gad, and Gad and destroy those lands. And the people of Reuben and Gad named the altar Proof that we believe that the Lord is God. How nice is that? I think that's really nice. It was awfully generous of them. I'm glad that they came to that conclusion. But you know, as I read over this story, there's one thing that kind of puzzles me and kind of sticks in my mind. As Phinehas and the elders were traveling home, were their faces a little red? As Phinehas and the elders were traveling home, did they have egg all over their face? They made a big mistake in what they did. Fortunately, the Lord guided them to a good solution. But let me ask you this. How much trouble, how much hurt feelings, how much anguish, how much embarrassment could have been avoided by the people of Israel if they had just gone and talked to Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh in the first place instead of assuming what they already thought was to be true? It's not for the important part. What does that mean for us today? You see, we, like the people of Israel, often make assumptions. And those assumptions are only based on the things that we observe. But that in itself is something of a problem. Our observations are actually quite limited. I can only make an assumption based on what I can see, what I can hear, what I can smell, what I can taste, what I can feel. I have no other information to help me make an assumption. How many of those different senses help me see inside someone's heart? How many of those different senses that I have help me understand what's going on in someone's life, that lets me know the entire backstory, that lets me know every battle that they've fought. None of them. First Kings chapter 8, verse 39. Forgive and treat each person as he should be treated, because you know what is in a person's heart. Only you know what is in everyone's heart. Now I want to be clear, because really what I'm churches do have an obligation to maintain morality and point out what they believe is right. I'm not really talking about churches as a whole today. If you want to read more about churches' obligations, you can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. That's really not what we're talking about today, though. But for individuals to be making judgments, it can be very dangerous. If we're looking to go to a metaphorical war over the things that we can observe, there's something that we need to keep in mind. You know, quite often, these conclusions we jump to are based in large part over anger. Look at the story over Israel. They were angry over what the other three tribes did. They were absolutely furious. And you know, in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 9, it tells us this: Don't let your spirit rush to be angry, for anger abides in the heart of fools. You know, I wonder how many of the Israelites felt foolish. Typically, it's anger over perceived wrong that gets us into a lot of this trouble. And I, for one, don't want to be a fool. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7. Talking about Christ. In Him we have redemption through His blood for the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of His grace. I tell you what. God is able to look at me. Because the way I look at David, not me, but well, yeah, it would be me too, but the way I look at David, the Old Testament author David and king, he shouldn't have a chance. I look at the life of David and I see a far worse things that he did than what Saul did. Saul didn't send his best friend out to be murdered so he could take his wife. Didn't happen. But I tell you what, God knows his heart. God knew everything that was going on in David's mind. And God was able to forgive him. Tell me, if God is able to forgive David, shouldn't we find the capacity to forgive others too? Amen. The truth of this story for our lives is that we must not assume the worst of others and instead love each other enough to find out the whole truth in every situation that arises. Maslow. Some of you have been to college, you probably have. You've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know Vernally's heard of him because you've taken some of the same classes as me. So, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He is or he was, I should say, he's deceased now, but he was a psychologist. And was this: if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. I want you to mull over that for just a second or two there. If the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. All right, let's be honest. Does it work real good? Not usually, no. How many of you got frustrated with something and thought it'd be a good idea to hit it with a hammer and see if that fixes it? Usually doesn't work. In fact, usually you create more of a problem. So let's put this into the context of what we're looking at today. I'm going to tell you something that's going to make you really uncomfortable. But don't worry, because I'm talking about me too. If all you have is evil in your life, you tend to observe other people's actions and assume they are evil too. You see, when I look in the mirror and I look at David Hoover, I don't see a nice, clean-shaven person that's all holy and ready to be taken up to heaven. That's not what I see. I see someone that's got a lot of problems. And is it possible that when I observe the things other people do, it's through the filter of my own indiscretions, my own problems, and I look at it so that all that I know is evil, and so therefore everyone else must be doing evil too? If all I have is evil in my life, all I'm going to find in other people is evil. If the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. The California State Automobile Association's claims office received a package by Federal Express, good old FedEx. But the unknown contents were bundled in a Fruit Loop cereal box. Apparently this person took a Fruit Loop cereal box, taped it up, and slapped a shipping label on it. Workers became, the workers became a little suspicious. You see, the FBI had only days before uncovered a terrorist bombing ring in New York. And the media had been crackling with some stories about terrorist bombings being sent through the mail. Security guards called the police, and about 400 office workers were evacuated from the building. The bomb squad soon arrived on the scene, and the Fruit Loop cereal box was neutralized with a small cannon. And its contents were blasted into the air. The bomb squad, however, found no explosives inside. Instead, the suspicious package was carrying $24,000 in cash. The box contained bundles of $20 bills, 1,000 of which were actually destroyed in the blast. This was a first, finding money, said platoon leader Jim Seam. The package arrived in such a way that aroused our suspicions, he said. We are able to render it neutral. You see, we always err on the side of caution. You know, caution's not necessarily a bad thing. But blanket suspicion can destroy things that are far more valuable than money. Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, "Listen, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. So be as smart as snakes and as innocent as doves." It's awfully hard to be innocent when you're being suspicious of everyone. It's awfully hard to be innocent when you're accusing people of wrongs without knowing the facts. You know, judging is such a touchy subject because there's all kinds of things that people view in conflicting ways. But I think it's safe to end in this. Before you jump to a conclusion, make sure you know the whole story. God calls you to know what's going on before you jump in and start trying to correct someone. As I said at the beginning of the week, this is a problem that can ruin friendships, kill relationships, even drive people away from Christ. Let's be smart about how we go about taking care of God's business in the future. Let's not jump to the conclusion that Israel did, and instead, let's find out the whole story before we jump in.